Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you all for being here. I hope that you're enjoying some snacks and conversation with friends. I'm Sora, I work here at MOHI. Thank you all for being here for tonight's Whose Stories? Our Stories, WTO Collective Memory Sharing. MOHI is so honored tonight to be partnering with the Community Alliance for Global Justice for tonight's event, and we're also excited that this is going to serve as the book launch for Global Battlefields, Memoir of a Legendary Public Intellectual from the Global South, which is Mr. Walden Bellows' book. Yeah, we're very excited to have him here tonight. Yeah, and the book is available for purchase in the back along with CAGJ merch, so do check that out. We hope you got a chance to see the Turtles, Teamsters, and Beyond, the legacy of the Seattle WTO protests exhibit upstairs. But if not, the exhibit will be up through April 27th with a chance to see it for free on Thursday, April 6th from 5 to 8 p.m. as part of our free First Thursday programming. As an important orientation to the space, we welcome you to take care of your needs. Bathrooms are past this light-up tower to the left and down the hallway. There's a cash bar in the back, along with free refreshments. So a little schedule of events. We'll be doing some on-stage things in the first half, remarks from Heather Day, a short panel, and then we'll be moving to small group discussions, so you'll all have a great chance to talk again. And as we ground in the space tonight, it's important to acknowledge that here at MOHI, we're on the historic and contemporary lands and waters of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Muckleshoot, and all Coast Salish people. Historically, Native communities were forcibly removed from this place, with lasting impacts on the land, water, and people. Therefore, it's important and critical to hold deep respect and gratitude for their unbroken stewardship of this place. We encourage you to visit the websites of local tribes to learn more about the people whose land you're on. Tonight's MC is Heather Day, Executive Director and co-founder of the Community Alliance for Global Justice. She co-founded CAGJ with others who helped organize the 1999 WTO protests and were inspired to build a membership-based, multi-sectoral organization for global justice here in Seattle. She was co-chair of the board for many years before becoming CAGJ's director in 2007. She lives in West Seattle with her son, Henry. Please give her a warm welcome.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I am Heather Day, as you know, and I organized this event with MOHI's dedicated staff, and I just want to thank MOHI for dedicating their resources over the past several months to telling the powerful stories of a people's victory that happened in the streets of Seattle in 1999. This is one in a series of events. There are several more coming up before the exhibit closes up at the end of April, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But if you haven't already seen the exhibit, you go up the stairs or the elevator, and it's in that corner upstairs, and it's great. At an acutely painful time in our history where we're facing threats and realities of fascism rising in our country and in other places around the world, it's important to remind ourselves that we have successfully beaten back oppressive forces before, and we can do it again. My life has been shaped by the WTO protests in many ways. The biggest reason why is that I co-founded the Community Alliance for Global Justice, which came directly out of the protests, and have been very actively involved ever since, along with many of you who are here tonight. CAGJ is proud to carry on that legacy, and I've personally felt a big responsibility for ensuring that our WTO stories be told and passed on to future generations. I decided about 5 years ago, when we did a People's Summit for the 20th anniversary, that what I really wanted to do for the 25th, well, one was to not do as much and to try to rest, but I've failed at that. But I wanted to create spaces for collective storytelling, and that's why we're here tonight. Every time I dig into the WTO archives or talk to friends who were there, I'm reminded what a deep well this moment of history represents. There are endless stories. And that's because tens of thousands of people participated, most of them for multiple days. And then many were impacted just because they're residents of Seattle and the surrounding areas. And then there are the millions of people whose lives were impacted by the news that an uprising against corporate globalization was taking place in the global north, in the belly of the beast. And I find it exhilarating that I keep learning new stories all the time. While I'm thrilled that we're doing this storytelling tonight, I feel like it's not enough time, and I want to do another event that's all day or all weekend. Like, we need more time. But I'm really pleased that I have the opportunity to organize this with Mohai and be with all of you. My mind had been made up to fight so-called quote-unquote free trade through my studies at the Evergreen State College, where we read and discussed books by Walden Bellow and others describing massive injustices being done to the Global South by international financial institutions, including the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. Corporations had shown over and over again that they had no allegiance to U.S. workers when they packed up and moved overseas, where they could be even more exploitative of workers and the environment. Later, Clinton sold us out on NAFTA and started the long march of pro-free trade neoliberal Democrats, who I believe are to be held partially responsible for the dangerous moment we now find ourselves in today in this country. Back then, I was thrilled to have the opportunity to do something by joining the NAFTA GATT Justice Committee, which was in Olympia, Washington, but it was a statewide coalition, and it's where I cut my teeth in grassroots organizing. We were protesting the radical new trade model represented by NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, as well as GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was the precursor to the WTO. I remember once we made a papier-mâché puppet and took it to Westlake Plaza in downtown Seattle to leaflet. I was happy that we reached a couple hundred people that day. We tried hard to educate the public, and it was great, but I would say, the events weren't super well attended. Imagine my exhilaration then when I stood on a street corner in downtown Seattle on November 30th, 1999, witnessing thousands of people from all over the world and walks of life protesting in that very same grid of streets, which had been transformed by direct action activists into a festival of arts and revolution. I felt so incredibly proud to experience my hometown becoming the epicenter of global activism for that one historical week against trade liberalization, deregulation, privatization, and structural adjustment policies. The vision represented by the map that you should go see if you haven't already, that's upstairs in the exhibit, had come to life. Thousands of people had, like me, made up their minds to speak out, and so many came to Seattle from far away to play their part to try to shut down the World Trade Organization's third ministerial. Many of them, and some of you, literally put their bodies on the line, blocking intersections and creating a massive ring of interlocking arms around the convention center to make it physically impossible for the ministers to enter. This strategic action created the first victory of the week. The ministerial was forced to cancel their opening ceremony that day. Amazingly, but not surprisingly, given the full year of effort that had led up to this moment. We did it. We shut it down. I remember where I was downtown and how stunned I felt when I learned of the meeting's opening being shut down from another of the Direct Action Network's organizers. She briskly walked up to me and she said, "We did it. It worked." Our eyes locked as I registered what she was saying, because I had been in other parts of the protest and I hadn't heard yet. And she kept moving down the street. I stood there thinking about how far the movement had come in the previous 6 years since those days of fighting NAFTA, when distributing a few hundred leaflets at the park felt like a great accomplishment, and that was right around the corner. The most important things I'd like to share with people who weren't there was first how privileged I feel to have experienced the protest because they made me feel genuinely hopeful. I also felt my heart open that week and felt so profoundly connected to other humans and nature like I'd never felt before, and I think I only experienced again with the birth of my son. In the brilliant documentary, This Is What Democracy Looks Like, which I love that we have a bunch of DVDs at our table that you're welcome to take one. I love how Hopkins described the joy of being together in the streets and resisting direct oppression of both the free trade agenda and the police who were trying to stop us as many protesters' first taste of freedom. That hope came from feeling powerful. And it started the night for me that I went to hear speakers at Benaroya Hall before the big day of action on November 30th. In the hall, which is the beautiful home to Seattle Symphony Orchestra. Such an elegant setting to hear Vandana Shiva, Martin Kaur, Elena Norberg-Hodge, and others. Walden, I know you spoke that weekend too. I and thousands of others knew about all these brave and brilliant people who were brought there by the International Forum on Globalization, as their public talks and books and activism had inspired us to get involved. For me, it was so powerful to see how the most radical voices of our generation were received in that great hall. It made me feel like maybe we do have the power to overcome all that we're up against. Ultimately, the WTO meetings that week ended in collapse. That was the real victory, and it was very much a result of people coming together that week to say a collective and resounding no. And just another key moment for me, two things I thought of just being together with our speakers tonight was organizing Voices from the Global South with Lilo and with Cindy specifically, bringing together activists from multiple continents who shared their stories of weathering the impacts of the free trade agenda and just hearing the commonalities between those stories. It was really powerful, and the room was packed. It was on Wednesday, the day after the big protests, and there were hundreds of people in the Garfield Community Center. It was incredible. And I heard the news that the meetings had collapsed outside of the Westin Hotel where we were protesting. Some brave activists had locked their necks to the doors of the Westin, symbolically to say that the delegates who were there shouldn't be allowed to leave Seattle until everybody was let out of jail. There was this incredible act of solidarity happening at the jail of the hundreds of people that were arrested. And I remember, Sonia, you were there, helping lead that action. That was one of the best moments of my entire life, hearing Mike Dolan announce that the meetings have collapsed. I couldn't believe it. It was just, I cried. The collapse can be attributed to the power dynamics both inside and outside the meetings. Inside, the most powerful governments met secretively, making backdoor deals, which angered less powerful nations of the Global South who were shut out of those negotiations. A press release after the meetings from the Organization of African Unity stated they were fed up with, quote, being marginalized and generally excluded on issues of vital importance for our peoples and their future. Outside, the protests proved that public opinion in the U.S. was split and that many stood in solidarity with the countries in the Global South who viewed free trade as just a new face of colonialism. Global South delegates inside were buoyed by the protests outside. They blocked consensus, and there was no New Deal. What did it all mean? What did we achieve? I think we'll be hearing from the speakers tonight. But I'm going to cite just a few voices who have summed this up. First, we shifted the narrative. Again, quoting Walden, who said in a 2016 quote, "In Seattle, ordinary women and men made truth real, with collective action that discredited an intellectual paradigm that had served as the ideological warden of corporate control." Mark Engler shared that shortly after the event, a front-page story in the Los Angeles Times read, "On the tear gas-shrouded streets of Seattle, the unruly forces of democracy collided with the elite world of trade policy. And when the meeting ended in failure, the elitists had lost the debate. Lost. The elitists had lost, and the debate was changed forever." The debate was changed forever. The WTO's power was greatly weakened in 1999. A longtime leader in the trade justice movement, Lori Wallach, stated that the WTO never recovered from its crisis of legitimacy. Negotiations continued, but never resulted in a new agreement. Arundhati Mittal of the Oakland Institute explained that WTO was once described as the jewel in the crown of multilateralism, but has come close to its demise several times since Seattle. The blow delivered to the WTO, and I quote, "in Seattle has been difficult to recover from." The next meeting was in Doha, which was followed by the collapse of talks in Cancun in 2003. There, Kenyan delegates walked out of the ministerial, followed by representatives of South Korea and India, As civil society mourned Lee Kyung-hae, a South Korean farmer who took his own life to protest the WTO's devastation of the Korean countryside. He stabbed himself at the barricades built to keep poor farmers and other protesters out of the talks. Hong Kong's meeting in 2005 followed, and the WTO had to satisfy itself with a minimum package, at best, function as its life support system. Since then, scared by massive mobilizations and protests and the growing confluence between delegates of the developing world and civil society, the WTO has been reduced to having mini ministerials with the hopes of hammering out a deal with a handful of its members. Its credibility as a multilateral institution has been reduced to tatters. Both Trump and Biden have refused to name judges to the WTO's court, thus limiting its power. And Deborah James, who's fought the WTO since 1999, is the head of the Our World Is Not for Sale network, recently stated, quote, if the so-called Millennium Round that WTO proponents tried to launch in Seattle had concluded, the world would be a much more unequal, exploitative, and ecologically devastated place. We actually stopped a terrible, no-good institution from getting even worse. To conclude, I'd like to share this summary of what we could take from the WTO for our movements moving forward, which was shared recently by an old friend and organizer, Timmy Gerson, who was reflecting on this great documentary that, if you haven't seen it, This Is What Democracy Looked Like. It's the best film that was made. We're very grateful to Jill Friedberg and others. It was quite simply a movement of movements, something we need and haven't had in this country for a long time. And the film showcases what it looks like when, 1, we have our own media, 2, we have a clear vision, 3, we understand what unites us is bigger than what divides us, 4, we refuse to allow our opponents to create wedges, 5, we take bold risks backed by major players willing to fight in the suites and in the streets, and finally, we make our movements local and global in practice, and not just in social media posts. So with that, I'd like to invite our speakers up to the stage. Come on up. Thank you. They will each be sharing their stories for 5 to 10 minutes. And just as a reminder of the flow of this evening, after they speak, we'll be inviting you to share at each of your tables. And depending on how long those first 2 parts of the program go, we're hoping to have 10 or 15 minutes at the end for questions and answers or for a little bit more storytelling. But we plan on wrapping up just a little bit, right around 9. So I'm going to introduce the speakers before they speak. So first we're going to hear from Walden Bello, who is a Filipino activist and academic who served as a member of the House of Representatives in the Philippines. He just arrived here yesterday. He co-founded the influential organization focused on the Global South, and in 2003 he was awarded the Right Livelihood Award. He's in Seattle, as you heard, to launch his new book called Global Battlefields, Memoir of a Legendary Public Intellectual from the Global South. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Heather, and I'd like to thank you and Moha for inviting me here to speak. I'm very happy to be here with friends, David, Fran, and Cindy, and everybody. So what I'd like to do is, following on Heather, I'd just like to read from the book, which has a section on the Seattle events. So let me just begin. The mood was electric and combative, and I reflected that in turn in my intervention at the affair that was held by the International Forum on Globalization, where David was into and speaking. I compared WTO to an iron cage, using Max Weber's image. An iron cage to trap the countries of the global south in underdevelopment. Quote, "It's about luring us into free trade in order to grab our markets with their corporate monopolies," unquote, I said, referring in particular to the agreement on agriculture. I ended my 10-minute intervention with the words, and I quote, "The future of corporate-driven globalization will depend on what we do here in Seattle," unquote. That was a rhetorical flourish. Little did I realize that it was a prediction of what would happen in the next few days and thereafter. It was raining at daybreak on the first day of the ministerial. I was billeted at the same hotel as Tomoko Sakuma, an activist from Japan that I had befriended in Singapore. And we set out together to see what was happening. With no central coordination, different groups of activists were positioning themselves at the different sites where delegates would be meeting, including the main venue, the Seattle Convention Center, as well as at the entrances of some hotels where delegations were housed. The plan, also spontaneously and democratically evolved, was to use peaceful, nonviolent means to block delegates from finding their way to the convention site. Very early on, the Seattle police were tear gassing and pepper spraying different clumps of people that had their arms linked. Some of the groups being attacked by the police had sat down on the pavement and, covering their faces with wet cloth to ward off tear gas and pepper spray, they refused to move. I spotted one group that was being broken up with clubs by the police and recognized Medea Benjamin of Global Exchange. At that point, I rushed to prevent a burly policeman from manhandling Medea, a person of slight build. Before I knew it, I was being wrestled to the ground by another officer, who then picked me up and hurled me several feet away, following this up by beating me with a club on my neck, my buttocks, and my legs. I scrambled away somehow, and when I looked back, the officer had taken off his helmet, and I saw that the person who had thrown me as if I were a leaf was a policewoman. By some miracle, my head had escaped blows from her club, but in the course of the next few hours, other parts of my body began to throb with pain. I got away but lost Tomoko in the confusion. By late morning, the police violence against peaceful demonstrators had turned into a full-scale police riot. Peaceful marches, including one involving several thousand trade unionists, were gassed and disrupted by the police, some of them mounted on horses. I somehow got into a march headed towards the famous Pike Place Market at Seattle Harbor, but it was charged by police and we scattered. Small skirmishes between unarmed demonstrators and police continued throughout the day, and it was only nightfall and rain that cleared the battlefield that Seattle had become of warring sides. Emboldened by 50,000 protesters clashing in the streets and with police and calling for abolishing the WTO, developing country delegates strongly resisted efforts by the EU and the US to steamroller them in committee discussions. This led to a failure to come out with points of agreement that would be brought together in a consensus statement. Even a visit by President Bill Clinton failed to move the negotiations forward. The de facto alliance between civil society in the streets and developing country representatives in the convention center had produced an outcome of massive significance, a defeat for the promoters of globalization. I wrote later something that Heather had quoted, and I just would like to end with this. Then came Seattle. After those tumultuous days, the press began to talk about the dark side of globalization, quote unquote. about the inequalities and poverty being created by globalization. After that, we had the spectacular defections from the camp of neoliberal globalization, such as the financier George Soros, Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, and the star economist Jeffrey Sachs. What made the difference? Not so much research or debate, but action. It took the anti-globalization actions of masses of people in the streets of Seattle, which interacted in synergistic fashion with the resistance of developing country representatives in the Seattle Convention Center and a police riot to bring about the spectacular collapse of a WTO ministerial meeting, to translate factoids into facts, into truth. And the intellectual debacle inflicted on the globalization by Seattle had very real consequences. Let me just end by saying Seattle was what the philosopher Hegel called a world historic event. Its enduring lesson is that truth is not just out there, existing objectively and eternally. Truth is completed, made real, and ratified by action. In Seattle, ordinary women and men made truth real with collective action that smashed an intellectual paradigm that had served as the ideological warden of corporate control. I think Donald Trump, among his many lies, is claiming, and will claim, that he is the one who stopped the WTO and neoliberal globalization. I think you can just imagine that he's in fact going to say that. Well, I think we have to remind ourselves and him that the WTO was stopped in Seattle and neoliberal globalization was reversed in Seattle. And I think that activists who came in, the people of Seattle, all contributed to this massive popular victory that I think the lesson of Seattle is that we have to repeat Seattle 1,000 times. Thank you.
Yes, yes, yes. Our next speaker is Sonia Sivison, who's a queer, anti-racist community acupuncturist. She was a co-founder of the Direct Action Network and helped shut down the WTO in 1999 and has been movement building and organizing for social change ever since. Sonia.
Yeah, so I just wanted to give a little context. In the mid-90s, I was a student at Evergreen and from the King County area, and there was all kinds of interesting activism happening, lively, full of coalition, off campus, on campus, people trying to figure out how to infuse creativity and songs and chants and art and try to have more expansive inclusivity in these movements that we're part of. And it was things like Shell Oil in Nigeria, the coalition of CISPIS, tell me what CISPIS. Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador was a big student organizing effort. There was all kinds of work around sweatshop labor, and Nike was a huge campaign. We would build giant puppets and go to the kingdom that was still a kingdom at the time, and do protests when Nike was sponsoring the baseball game. A new book had just come out called Criminal Injustice that was edited about the prison crisis in this country, and on campus, we really use it as an opportunity to talk with Chicanos, with queers, with women, with people with disabilities, with environmental justice organizers, and talk about how prisons were impacting all of our movements in all these different ways. There was also a lot of cop watch work. There was a lot of work for unhoused people. In 1997, a big group of people from Evergreen went up to Vancouver for APEC, which stands for the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation. General Suharto was there. There was amazing direct actions. It was also very rainy and very cold, and most people were sick. And the protests were lively and intense, and we're told down here that Canada is a little bit gentler. They used Royal Mounted Police. They had horses trying to arrest us. They threw organizers into unmarked vans who were trying to talk to Suharto. There was a lot of good songs and good chants. For example, I mean, this is like 30 years ago, and I don't talk to these people anymore, but I know the chant. It was, "Don't you want to know who stole your paycheck? Look in the wallet of the guys from APEC." That was a catchy one. That one really went far. So we were starting this group, Art and Revolution, and there was the giant puppets that we see upstairs. It was really trying to engage people on the sidewalks and get them to come into the streets with us, to talk to students about what was going on, and to try to have things feel more festive and creative and a reason why you'd want to get involved. So we were doing these convergences called Art and Revolution and teaching people how to walk on stilts, how to build murals, how to paint, how to do graffiti, lots of really fun stencils. We were talking, there was a convergence up at Prague Tree Farm in Arlington. There's going to be one in a few weeks on Vashon. I totally encourage people to keep coming to these things. But because we were building these kind of movements and coalitions, I moved to the Bay Area after college, and we were working on talking about how the WTO was coming here and who could we get involved to do direct action. And so we started conference calls. There was no cell phones at the time. People from San Diego up through Vancouver, all along the West Coast, is who we were working with. And it was a lot of folks in the anarchist movement, people who have been doing nonviolent direct action for a long time, people from a lot of different movements, and talking about consensus decision-making and affinity groups and nonviolence and shutting things down. And there's lots of talk, you know, there's a lot of different opinions about all of those things, and we just kept coming back to how can we train people in facilitation skills, how can we have consensus be our decision-making, and we're all on the same page in these ways. Fast forward to the 420 space, which we called the Convergence Center, where we were doing more of these anti-racist trainings, facilitation trainings, nonviolent direct communication trainings, de-escalation with the police trainings, trying to think ahead of what's going to happen here. We're also doing all of this work with the maps. So now that we've talked about all these intersections of political movements, the next real big piece that I remember about the WTO is clusters, pies, spokes councils. That was what my group was focusing on. We were focusing on how do we have all of these affinity groups all over the city, let alone the world, who are coming here, to actually break the city down into a pie. That is what we did. Our cluster was called Key Lime Pie and Ready Whip, as in the whipped cream can. And so there were so many creative affinity groups, and then people are doing all kinds of things. I mean, you can see this is multiple days of actions with 50,000 people in the streets. There was so many elements of the communication happening that a lot of what we were doing was trying to figure out ways that the information can get readied back to each other. And so, for example, on Tuesday, which is the big day that everyone talks about, which was an amazing success with lockboxes and roving choruses and yes, the tear gas and pepper spray and rubber bullets, not a success, but shutting down the actual WTO ministerial meetings, huge success. And we were a little surprised that not more people got arrested that day. But then they really started arresting people on Wednesday. There was a huge part at Westlake Center, and my affinity group, watched. Well, for example, even trying to get into there, the police would stop you. We had some oranges because you're going to be gone all day and you might be hungry. The police took the oranges. Those were considered weapons. Everyone had signs. A lot of the signs were taken by the police. So then people started painting on sheets our messages of what we were saying. I remember on Wednesday night we got home and we were watching the news coverage, and it was a real good lesson in corporate media does not tell the truth. We were there, and they were like, these people don't have any message. They're not saying anything. They have not. We're like, you took our signs, and then you criticize us for not having a message. We're holding up this message so clearly. What are you talking about? But, you know, we created our own independent media centers. Like, we worked around that, and we really figured out how to have media. But, for example, on this Wednesday, there was a peaceful sit-in. Many, many people were sitting in and were getting arrested, and we watched a lot of the organizers arrested. So several of us were a little worried who was going to run the spokes council meetings at the Convergence Center and keep all this communication going. So that day, we intentionally tried to not get arrested so that we could help facilitate the meetings that night. The rainy week continued. It was a real rainy week, and there was a lot of amazing marches through Weyerhaeuser, through the Nike Town, through Victor Steinbrook Park. amazing protests that you're going to hear more about as things go on, more tear gas, more arrests. But because so many people were arrested, and because the police kept tear gassing people in neighborhoods who weren't really even involved in the protest, let alone the protesters shouldn't have been getting tear gassed, the jail support became a huge thing. And so that was another angle. There has been a lot of legal organizing, legal observers, phone numbers, what to do when you got arrested. And so the jail solidarity became this huge focus, and we were all at the jail a lot. And it was pretty amazing. There was a huge call and response. There was a lot of legal information we were getting back and forth. We also wanted to know that people inside the jail were safe and okay. We were trying to get them out. And it was, for me, one of the first times I'd seen hundreds and hundreds of people do the call and response effect. So you know, I'll try. You respond. We demand, the immediate release, of all prisoners. And the people could hear us upstairs. The people who were in the jail at the top floor could hear us. They were calling out. We eventually did get them out. There's lots more to say. I'm going to wrap up. I just wanted to end on one thing. So that was, the end of 1999. In 2000, a lot of the people who I knew went to anti-globalization protests in D.C. against the IMF and the World Bank. Again, hundreds of people were arrested there. It was a disaster. I mean, it was not as organized, and it was not a planned arrest, and there was a huge lawsuits. You were hogtied, you were overnight on buses. They took you to all kinds of strange jail facilities. But the point is, people were mobilizing, people were refusing to back down and realize the connection of the IMF and the World Bank and the WTO. And after that, I was in DC, got arrested, did all that. Then I was doing a road trip around the country talking to organizers, and I visited quite a few political prisoners in multiple states. Linda Evans, Mutulu Shakur, Herman Bell, Herman Hooks Wallace of the Angola Three. These people knew so much about what had happened at the WTO in Seattle. I was there to talk to them about other things. Everyone wanted to talk about the WTO. They were so excited and inspired. And there was just something about 6, 8, 10 months later, prisoners had heard such level of detail about what was going on and felt this hope. And it really just kind of sunk in. What does it mean when you actually win? When we fight, we win. So I think that's the moral of the story. Let's keep fighting so we can keep winning.
Thank you, Sonia. Next, we're going to hear from Pete Knudsen, who's a hero of mine. He's an activist fisherman who runs Loki Fish Company, who you've probably seen at the farmers markets with his family. And he's been teaching cultural anthropology at Seattle Central since 1989. Wow. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Seattle Central was famously called the home of the loony left by Joel Conley in the Seattle PI. He always, because we're sort of a nexus between Beacon Hill, the Central District. In fact, the school was born in protest. Initially, they were going to just give it like some basic vocational classes, and then there were strikes and there were riots led by the Black Student Union, Chicanos, and others. So that's how we got our start, and that's why I think Seattle Central made a lot of sense to be a nexus for the resistance during the WTO. I just have a couple of thoughts, and then I was going to just go through what I told the students right after the WTO. One of the thoughts I have, and of course, all this discussion, the value of it is what does it do for us today in the political context that we're in right now. And one of the things I remember about the WTO is I remember watching Pat Buchanan on television. He was a right-wing pundit, and he was chortling about the battle in Seattle, as he called it. And in retrospect, when I think about it, the difference, I think Seattle, it had a combination of defend local, but also think globally and have global solidarity. And if you split those two things apart, you end up with Donald Trump. No, I'm serious. I think he took the defend local, the ethnocentric part, and split it off. And they rail against globalists. They rail against a lot of things that people without a political analysis think make sense. And the power of the WTO is that you brought that international solidarity together. One of my favorite anthropologists, not often taught here in the United States, is a Cuban by the name of Fernando Ortiz. And he developed, in a book called Cuban Counterpoint, he developed the notion of transculturation, which I think is the antidote to that ethnocentrism that we see so much, that's emphasized today. So what I told the students, I said, I started off talking about the way the police were enforcing the WTO. And I told them, I said, I've never been much of a shopper, particularly at Nordstrom's or the Gap. But when we were marching downtown today, I said, bring a couple shopping bags with you. I said, it's a good idea to bring your own bags when you demonstrate downtown, just in case you get the urge to go do some early Christmas shopping. I mean, this was like early December, right? So what happened on Capitol Hill was that a Seattle Central student, one of my students, overheard a sergeant telling his police squad how to profile the civilian population. Only instead of racial profiling, they were profiling protesters and shoppers, because they wanted to leave it open for shoppers. So the sergeant told his men that it was important to get the troublemakers and not the responsible citizens, i.e. the shoppers. So he told them that if people on the street were wearing backpacks, they were probably protesters, and they deserved a little pain compliance, as they said. If, on the other hand, they were carrying bags, they were probably just shoppers, and they were okay. Let them go shopping. So I told the students, bring your gas mask and your swim goggles, but put them in a Nordstrom's bag. And in a way, it felt like this is what our First Amendment rights have come to. A gas mask in one hand, a Nordstrom's bag in the other. And of course, then when you go through the National Guard line, when we were under martial law, you had to take off all your political paraphernalia to get downtown. So anyways, I was walking downtown with one of my students, and she had a gas mask in her pack. A cop, I think it was a King County sheriff, saw it. Boom, she was immediately arrested. And it was horrible, and I took some pictures. But it was symbolic at the same time, because banning a gas mask is essentially banning the right to protect yourself. And that's a really apt metaphor for what the political and economic system is doing. It's taking away our ability to defend ourselves. So the WTO was about making it illegal for us to protect our rights, our food, our knowledge, our genetics, our planet. This is called free trade. And so wearing a gas mask was protectionism, supposedly. So it's not a new story. This goes back to early state civilizations. Max Weber defines the state as the institution that controls organized violence. And so the WTO, really, you can think about it as an attempt to legitimate stealing of common resources by private interests. And this is what we're seeing today in the era of Trump. We're seeing moves to privatize our educational system, moves to privatize our Social Security, the prison system's already privatized largely, to divide up the commons, just as the Europeans did in Africa in the 19th century. Anyways, when we think back on the WTO, this is what I think about. I think of the Turtles, I think of the Teamsters, I think of the lesbian Avengers, I think of the hula hoop guys, I think of the French farmers, I think of the steel workers, I think of the puppeteers, the African delegates, the longshoremen who closed down the West Coast, the students in Mexico City demonstrating in solidarity, the community college students and the UW students coming downtown, and the Seattle firemen who refused to turn their fire hoses on their fellow citizens. So each of those was a brushstroke on a much larger canvas. So to sum up, I would say it was one of the best weeks of my life, and I'm changed. And I think it's a real good lesson for people today that you're not powerless. And it may seem like things are calm on the surface, but it just takes a spark, and all of a sudden the world turns upside down.
Next, I'm honored to introduce Cindy Domingo, who's really a local legend, Filipina-American organizer with Lilo, a legacy of equality, leadership, and organizing. It's hard to summarize Cindy. She does so many different things, but I liked how the International, or has done so many things, but I like how the International Examiner put it. Cindy Domingo has been a long-standing revolutionary, political activist, ardent feminist, and community figure inside Seattle and beyond. Please welcome Cindy.
Thank you, Heather. I think I'm just going to sit here and do my 5 minutes. You know, when I think about Heather said it, I've done a lot of things in my life, and so it's good to be here to remember what the WTO meant. You know, I think the highlight for me was something that didn't come to fruition during the WTO. I was responsible to organize Fidel Castro to come, which he never did come for a couple of reasons, of which the U.S. could not guarantee his safety. But what I want to talk about today is more of a lesson that we have to remember, and Pete raised it, is to think locally. Because what happened in the WTO is there were all these accomplishments to stop the WTO, but our local community, especially our local communities of color, were forgotten and left out of the planning, left out of the involvement in opposing the WTO to come to Seattle. Early in the spring of that year was when the organizing of the to protest the WTO in Seattle started happening, and initiated by Public Citizen and Mike Nolan. Immediately, Lilo, who the year before had a small gathering of about 30 people, half which came from out of the country, to talk about the impact of globalization and trade agreements on their communities in Africa, in Central America, in Mexico, and in Asia. A conference in which the slogan, "Speaking for ourselves, speaking to each other," so that we could hear the stories one-on-one of what the impact of these trade agreements meant for workers in all these various countries. For Lilo, it was groundbreaking, but it was something that we always believed in at the very beginning of our 50-year history. And Tyree Scott, who many of you know, initiated that type of conversation and exchange and building of solidarity amongst those workers from around the world. So we brought that experience with us to the planning which began at the old labor temple of predominantly white environmentalists and white labor leaders and activists. But our involvement was not appreciated, essentially. And Mike Dolan said, we have to make this big. We don't have time to focus on this local community, and essentially we don't have time to focus on the communities of color. We want to stop the WTO, and at a certain point, they said, we're going to hand this organizing to staff. We don't have money to give you to organize in your local communities of color. We know that there's organizing going on by organizations of color, like Lilo, Community Coalition for Environmental Justice, etc., but we don't have money, and we're not going to give you the space to raise your ideas or mobilize your people. because we have many people coming from all over the world to pay attention to. It's a lesson that we brought with us in organizing the U.S. social forums throughout the country after the WTO happened in Seattle. So they did not appreciate the slogan, speaking for ourselves and speaking to each other or anybody else. And so at a certain point, through that organizing from the spring of that year into the summer, we struggled. There were about six major organizations of communities of color that struggled to become involved in that broader broader coalition that brought those folks to Seattle to organize. At a certain point in September, we decided that our efforts and voices were being unheard, and we formed our own Workers' Voices Coalition. And we decided that we will speak for ourselves, and we will speak to those that are interested in hearing from experiences from the 10 workers of color that we brought from around the world that had attended the year before our conference that we held and developed what was we now call the CBIC principles. And we continued and if you look at the pictures, you can see that there are very few faces of color in those demonstrations, especially in the labor contingents, environmental. You can see that the faces of color are missing, and that especially those that came from the communities of color. And so I leave that lesson because it's a lesson that we continue to hammer at in every coalition, every alliance that we build, whether it be local, national, or international, that it's always important to have those voices of color at the center, not at the periphery, not just to have up in front, just to have, but to hear about those experiences, to have decision-making power, to have resources to organize our communities, because we are the most impacted by those trade agreements. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Cindy. Our final speaker is Jonathan Rosenblum, who's a longtime union and community organizer in Seattle. In 1999, he was director of Seattle Union Now, AFL-CIO, a joint initiative of the National AFL-CIO, the King County Labor Council, and local and international unions. He's currently working with Amazon workers organizing nationwide and has a forthcoming book later this year on socialist political struggle in Seattle. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thanks, Heather, and thanks to all the organizers of tonight's event. It's great to see so many of you from 25 years ago. Your hair color has changed. So has mine. So many of the protest groups intended to shut down the WTO, but most unions, at least the leaders of those unions, would have settled for a seat at the table, a voice in trade matters. This was a central tension within the movement. Would the movement stand united in opposing the WTO, or would elements of the movement allow themselves to be split off and to make a separate peace with the political and economic masters? As you heard, Tuesday was the opening of the ministerial meeting, right, when direct action protesters successfully blockaded the meeting. The labor march, how many people were on the labor march? Okay, you know, we left out of Memorial Stadium planning to go down to Pine Street, but at the last minute, the march officially bailed. When AFL-CIO President John Sweeney got reports of the downtown unrest and the police violence, he had his staff try to redirect the labor march back to the stadium. If you were one of the many marshals on that parade, you remember we were hearing on the radios, turn the march around, and we were supposed to go left and then left again and head back to the stadium. Most of the marchers, certainly the rank and file workers, continued downtown anyway because we just had to be there. And that night I remember hearing a national union leader declare victory, saying, we're done here. We've done our job. We've made a powerful statement. President Clinton had publicly said that labor now needed to be considered in trade agreements. And what he said is there's nothing more to be gained by protesting further, and there's a lot more to lose if we were to stay in the streets. And our job was to go home at that point. Now, the following morning, Wednesday, December 1st, the steelworkers staged a rally on the waterfront. One of the pictures shows that. It was raining. Well, wait a minute. It was raining every day that week, wasn't it? This was a sanctioned rally allowed by the authorities. As the rally ended, how many people were there, by the way? Okay, you remember this? Teamsters union leader Bob Hasegawa ran up to the microphone and announced they're tear gassing students downtown. And just as he was saying, let's go downtown to be in solidarity, somebody shut the mic off on him. Well, a bunch of us went anyway, about 200 people, up the Pike Place Hill climb, along with the French CGT delegation, where we met up with a huge crowd of young protesters at 2nd and Pike, and we were promptly felled by a police ambush, tear gas, concussion grenades, the whole 9 yards. Police herded a group of the protesters north and kettled them just beyond the Labor Temple on 1st Avenue. So I personally had escaped the police dragnet. I made it back to the Labor Temple, and I went up to the Labor Council office on the 2nd floor where Ron Judd, the head of the King County Labor Council, had just returned from a day of meeting with WTO delegates inside the Westin Hotel. And he was very excited. He said, Jonathan, you got to see this. We're being heard. They're paying attention to us now. And I said, you got to come out and see what's happening. We went downstairs. We went out on the street just north of the Labor Temple, and we saw all the police surrounding these soon-to-be arrestees. And Judd was appalled. He got on the phone with the deputy mayor, Maud Dodon, and he was using, these big old brick phones that we used to have. And he said, you won't believe what's happened. Just as he was talking to the deputy mayor, a cop came up and just clubbed him on the back of the neck. That was a transformative blow. We went back to the Labor Temple, and Judd immediately started calling allies, saying we need to get back out on the streets, and that Labor Council was hosting an emergency planning meeting the following morning, Thursday morning. So that morning, I was inside. I don't remember that. Okay. That morning, with the sun out, protest organizers met, and we agreed to turn out people for Friday at noon outside the Labor Temple. But the debate over tactics, over what we would do, was still unsettled until that evening when about 40 of us, a wide range of WTO protest organizations, met at the Lilo office for a final planning session. The central question that night was whether to challenge authority to contest the no-protest zone and the mass jailings, or to limit ourselves to a non-threatening rally. And for the first hour that night, speakers laid out their various ideas and perspectives. Everyone sensed in that meeting that our unity was delicate. And then one speaker said what we needed to do was to take mass arrests. And a union staff person replied promptly that labor is not going to do that. With that, the meeting exploded with recrimination and anger. The sharp battle lines that had simmered just below the surface all week emerged in stark relief. Tyree Scott, who you heard about before, an electrician, a rank-and-file union member, and co-founder of Lilo, spoke up and he said, "Who are you to come here and say that? You don't speak for labor." The union staffer, truth be told, had himself been in the streets that week, battling police alongside young protesters. We were all beyond exhaustion, and his words were poorly chosen. But the sharp conflict now was laid bare before us. The staffer apologized, The tension lifted slightly, and Tyree spoke again. He said, "Who are we?" he asked, "if we didn't confront the protest ban? It was an attack on everyone's rights. We had to march." "And who was in jail?" he asked. "These are workers too," he said. On that basis, the group reached consensus. Marched through the no protest zone downtown on Friday, an act of mass civil disobedience, and then back to the Labor Temple. And then, following the march, anyone who wished to could go to the jail for solidarity action. Mind you, there were other forces outside the room at the same time, the National AFL-CIO being the most prominent one, where I was still getting my paycheck from, who remained adamantly opposed to any Friday action. But at least there was unity in that room by the end of Thursday night, and the next morning on Friday, more than 5,000 people gathered outside the Labor Temple, and we marched straight through the heart of the mayor's no protest zone, reclaiming our city. The police stood back. When we returned jubilantly to the Labor Temple, a dance party erupted in the streets, and then a good portion of us went back through downtown to jail, where we joined hundreds of young activists already occupying the square. We gave courage to the detainees who, as you heard earlier, were waving their arms from behind the jailhouse windows as we chanted up at them. And throughout the weekend, labor started to show up as a consequence of the Friday march. Labor started to show up outside the jail. Teamsters, longshore workers, construction workers, and others who'd never been to a protest before in many cases. They brought food, they brought blankets, tarps, they got to see what the spokes councils were about. They got involved in ways they hadn't before. And the solidarity between street activists and labor was transformative, and I believe helped bring down the WTO. By the end of that weekend, the ministerial meeting had collapsed in disarray, and our people were out of jail. Now, that was 25 years ago, but the lessons are equally valid today. For me, unions are essential for social transformation, but they also are highly imperfect organizations. People in positions of authority can easily get myopic, narrow-minded, and cautious, or worse. As we fight Trump and the plutocrats, we also have to struggle within our own organizations to demand that they live out their mission to fight for everyone. If Tyree were here, I'm sure he'd remind us that the campus protesters for Palestine are workers too, that the high school students fighting for climate justice are representing the interests of all workers, that the movement for Black Lives is fighting police violence everywhere, whether in black and brown neighborhoods or on our union picket lines. He would remind us that in our working class movement, there is no separate peace. There wasn't then, and there isn't today. Thank you.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you so much to each one of you.